Well, good morning to you all, and Happy New Year to those who I have not said it to already. It is exciting to be here at 2024 and to just think about how far we come. Every time it starts a new year, sometimes we think about how many years it's been since something, right? And then sometimes on certain years. So like 2024, for me, it was 2004. When I asked a young lady to marry me. It was in that year, and it's like, wow, that was 20 years ago. But it's been a joy. But it's good to look back, but it's also good to look ahead. And that's what we're going to talk about. Pastor's already mentioned several times where we are going today in the service as we look at the theme for this year of looking unto Jesus. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to the book of Hebrews chapter 12. And while you're doing that, I just want to kind of get us in the mindset that in general, we are all good at looking. As people, we are good at looking. I'll just remind you some of the things I've seen in my life and I've experienced. Now, if you're in your house or in your car and you hear an accident happen, what do we all do? We go look at what happened, right? This week at my kids' school, at my children's school, they were doing a lot of construction, so they had a big excavator. And whenever I would go, I would linger a little longer in my car. Why? So I could look at what they were doing. I don't think any boy ever grows up big enough he doesn't like to watch big machines work. May that must be me, but I think that's the case for everybody. And so we're good at looking at that. If you walk down Barnett Street, why do the stores put a lot of things in the windows, whether dresses, clothes, phones? Why do they do that? Because we're good at looking at things, right? Or as a student, what is a student best known for looking at? Anybody? The clock as to when the day is over. I remember, I knew where the clock was in my classroom. 15 more minutes. Still 15 more minutes. Some of you might be doing that right now. I don't know. So we are good at looking. Unfortunately, we're good at looking. Sometimes our eyes linger on things that we should not, or we look at things we should not. We are general good lookers, and it's not a new thing. If you think of, you don't need to turn there, the book of Exodus, Moses was out taking care of sheep, and he noticed what? He noticed a bush that was burning, not on fire. And what did Moses say? I need to turn aside, and I got to look at this. That's it. He said it in a fancier way. I must turn aside and see this sight. But that's what he was doing, right? He was looking at things. As we think about looking, we are turning our attention as a church this year to the theme of looking unto Jesus from the book of Hebrews chapter 12. And so we need to consider that. Now, I will let you know a little preview already. This year, while I speak this year, we are actually going to do a study all the way through the book of Hebrews. So this is somewhat an introduction to the theme and a precursor to what we'll be studying some of this year. But in order for you to understand the very end of Hebrews here, where we're talking about looking unto Jesus, I need to give you just a brief overview of what the book of Hebrews is all about. Now, the book of Hebrews really is, in general, this idea that Jesus is better and more worthwhile than whatever your culture is at the time. Now, specifically, at the time of the book of Hebrews, the people to whom the author of Hebrews was writing to were being tempted and considering going back to the Old Testament way of doing things and many of the ways that they are living. And the author is trying to help them understand that Jesus is better than those things. He's better than Moses. He's better than angels. And as we go through it this year, we're going to see that. But the reality is that the idea is that Jesus is better than whatever your culture is offering you at this time. And specifically, as it goes through the book of Hebrews, it's talking about Jesus is better than this, he's better than this, he's better than this. And to give you an example, the book of Hebrews is actually a sermon. You're reading a sermon when you write it. And so Hebrews chapter 11 is the part in the sermon where the speaker, the preacher, really gets into giving people a practical illustration. We all enjoy when someone is a good speaker if they give good illustrations and they help you connect. And in Hebrews chapter 11, right before the passage we're going to talk about today, the preacher goes into all of these different stories from the Old Testament of different people and how they demonstrated faith. It talks about Abel and Abraham and Moses, and it goes on and on and on. It's explaining how all of these people demonstrated faith. Now, we're not going to talk about that chapter today, but the preacher just goes over name after name after name, illustration after illustration after illustration. Much like I started saying we're good at looking at this and this and this. It's that idea of driving home the point. All of these people demonstrated faith. And because of that, the preacher's now going to finish his sermon in chapters 12 and 13. Now, you can imagine the preacher here, when he gets to chapter 12, this is the first time he says he's going to wrap up, right? I don't know if you've ever been in a sermon. I know it never happens here, but the whoever's preaching says, I'm going to wrap up with this, and then they say that like 3 more times, right? So Hebrews chapter 12 is part 1 of the wrap-up, and that is where we come today. I'm not talking about you, Pastor. I'm talking about myself. But in Hebrews chapter 12, we're just going to read these 2 verses we're going to focus on today, here in Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. So we have in our mind, Jesus is better than everything else, and because of that, these people in the past have demonstrated faith. So, Hebrews 12, 1 says this, and I'm reading from the ESV. It says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the founder and perfecter, or author and finisher of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despised the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Now, there is so much in this passage and so much that we want to look at, but we really want to come to that idea of why is this phrase, looking unto Jesus, so important. So the first thing we have to realize is that the author is kind of putting together this idea of the race of life in the first verse. He's using the race mentality and the race idea. And from that, then, we have this term of witnesses. Now, witnesses has a lot of different meanings to it, but specifically here, it is witnesses or a testimony, people who give evidence for how the race can be run. So this isn't necessarily people telling about how you're doing. These are people who have been giving witness to doing something before. If you are all interested in going to a new restaurant or a new location, many of us are prone to do what? Go onto Google and we look at what? Or we're buying something. We look at reviews. Anybody look at reviews? We like to read what other people have experienced at a place. That is the idea of people who have gone before and give witness or testimony to the race that has gone. For example, I'm going to give a few race examples because in a life prior to my current one, when I was lighter and younger, I enjoyed long-distance running. Long distance is a relative term depending on your age and fitness level, right? So last year, I made a goal of running 15 miles every month. And I made it. I was really happy. I have a friend who made a goal of running 100 miles every month. So it's a relative term. I thought I did pretty good with 15, but I was not ready to do 100. But the idea of a race here is that people have run before, and they're giving testimony, they're giving witness to that. And specifically, it's these people who have, in chapter 11, all these people who have demonstrated faith. Because they have shown that they can have faith, we are surrounded by those witnesses. And so we are to lay aside every weight and sin which clings to us. This is the idea of removing the obstacles, and we might come back to that a little bit later. I want to focus on this idea of run with endurance, the race is set before us. Now, endurance is a word that is going to show up in verse 1, verse 2, and verse 3. Now, we're not going to verse 3, but every time you see a word repeated over and over and over again in Scripture, it's important. And so here, the author of Hebrews is saying the word endurance is important. And the idea of endurance is persevering specifically when things get difficult, right? It's not enduring if you're enjoying the whole process, right? So, for example, some of you are sitting here today in nice, comfy seats. You may not know, if you're new here, that these seats are new. For a long time, we have endured sitting on other chairs, right? And you're sitting there, and the speaker's going, and you're trying to get comfortable, right? You're enduring by staying in the chair. But now these new comfy chairs, it's not as much of endurance, right? It's comfortable, it's nice. The preacher can go as long as he wants. It's not as difficult. I'm just kidding. I'll be done by 1. It's all right. Enduring is specifically persevering when it is difficult. And that is why the idea of a long race is such a powerful example. Only once have I ever run a marathon. And run is I'll put it in quotation marks, because I was not running the whole time. See, when you run a marathon and you train for it, you get pretty good at 1 mile, 2 miles, 5 miles, and even you can get pretty good at 10 miles. But it starts to get hard, mile 13, 14, 15, and that is why they're called endurance races, because nobody runs it pain-free and easily. No matter how much you train, it gets difficult. And the point of enduring is persevering through difficulty. And that is why endurance is used here for this race of life. I wish I could tell you that the race of life was a quick, easy sprint or a quick, easy drive. I was even talking recently, someone talked about they wanted to try golf so they could try driving a golf cart. Well, one of the fascinating things, if you play professional golf, are you allowed to use a cart? Not many golfers here, but you can't. Professional golfers, for the professionals, they have to walk the whole course to play it. And thus, their physical demanding of the sport plus the walking is partly what makes it more difficult than it looks like. We say, we're just hitting a big round ball. Don't worry, I don't play golf. I'm not good at it. But the idea is that even a lot of these activities that take a long time require endurance. And the life is going to require endurance. But specifically, at the end of verse 1, it says, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, that is laid out before us. And I like this idea that it's not that you are going out for a run or a walk or you're living life and you get to choose the path that you take. You are instead pursuing a race that has been set out for you. One time we got to visit Charity's sister, and she invited me to run a race in her town. I agreed because I enjoyed running. Now, where I live, I knew all the roads around my house, and I knew if I got to this corner how much further I had to run. If you know your neighborhood, running can be a little bit easier. But for her, we started the start line. I had no clue where we were going or how far it was from every corner. And as we were just running, I'm just looking at, are we almost done? Like, when's the finish line? I don't know where I am. I don't know what's going on. I don't know when the next turn's going to be. I don't know anything. I just had to run with endurance or patience the race that was set out for me. I didn't choose the race. I didn't choose where the turns were. I didn't choose where the hills were, unfortunately. They kept going up instead of down. I had to continue just to persevere the race that had been chosen for me. And it is the same way as we approach year 2024. You have goals. I know I've recently been writing some goals. You have plans, all sorts of different thoughts and ideas, and we have an idea of how 2024 will go, right? I know I have a list of dates of a lot of different things that are going to happen, and people are coming and all this stuff. It's good to make a plan, but for you and for me and for this church, 2024, the race is already laid out for us. God knows what is coming for you and for me in this church this year. And I will let you know it's going to require endurance, because we do not know the turns, the bumps, the hills that are coming at us this year. We must run with endurance the race. So how do we then endure? How do we run the race that is set before us? And that is where we come to verse 2 and our key theme and phrase for this year, looking unto Jesus. And specifically, the author here focuses on a few things about Jesus in verse 2. There's a lot about Jesus in just this one verse. And it uses these two words, founder and perfecter, or author and completer. And we're going to come back to that first word a little bit later, author, the idea of beginning. We're going to come back to that word a little bit later. But I want to talk about this idea of the perfecter or a completer. Now, this word in the Greek is only used in this verse in the New Testament, and even in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it doesn't show up. So it's a word that must not have been that common, but it gives us that idea of something that finishes or wraps up or completes, that is showing, and Jesus is finishing everything that he has started, everything that he has done. He is the finisher. All these people who are witnesses have gone before, but if you notice in Hebrews 11, if you're looking in verse 39 and 40, it says, all of these, so all the people who are the witnesses, though commended through their faith, they did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. They had to wait for something. And what is the something they were waiting for? That comes in the next verse. Verse 1 and 2, Jesus, who is the perfecter, the completer. He is the one who brought together the witnesses and us who are running this race in one people to receive the fruit, the result, the outcome of the faith. Now, how did Jesus then do this? And it says here in the next phrase, for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. And that's where we see that word endure again, right? Endurance. He endured the cross. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of the physical details of the cross, but there have been many ways created to execute human beings. The French use the guillotine. There's been beheadings of various kinds, electric chairs, and all sorts of different things. And many of them are designed to do what? Make the process quick. The cross was intended to make the process long. The cross was specifically a brutal process that involved agony prior to being on the cross, and then a long time on the cross by which you were to suffer and suffer and suffer. And so when it says that Jesus endured the cross, we are getting the same word that was just given to us to endure the race that is set before us. Is it no wonder that other places in the Bible says that we are to take up our cross? To give us that idea. Jesus endured the cross. He knew what the cross was going to take of him, and he knew he was going to go through the process. And yet, what did he do? He endured the cross. He willingly went down the path knowing he would endure that. Some people ask me when I do long-distance run, why do you do this? You know it is painful. You know it is difficult. Why do you do it? I've never come up with an answer. But Jesus, why did he endure the cross? He does have an answer. It says a joy before him. And we'll come to that in a second. He endured the cross. But there's also this phrase, despising the shame. Now, we often focus on the idea of the cross, that Jesus died for us, and we often forget about this idea of shame. The cross was a shameful process. He was naked, he was abused, he was hung out for that. We don't often use the word shame here in Jamaica, but we use the word respect. We don't like to be disrespected. And arguments, I've seen arguments take place from someone who felt they were disrespected. Jesus was disrespected and shamed for us. He went through willing shame for us. He knew he'd be beaten. He knew he'd be naked. He knew he'd have to parade through the streets like that. He endured it for that reason. And what is the reason? The joy that was set before him, and I love how it ends, he's seated at the right hand of God. I want us to stop there and think about this idea of the joy that was before him. Because one of the problems often in Christian culture, and I've seen it myself even in my younger and older years, is we often tell people you need to get saved because the Christian life is great, or you get to go to heaven, or there's these blessings and all these different things. And that is not untrue. But here we have to think about this idea of the gospel and its impact on Jesus himself. So think with me. Jesus had access to how much wealth and how much power? Unlimited. He had access to that at any time. The Bible tells us he could have called and he could have done anything that he wanted to do. He chose not to. But what then was the joy that he was looking forward to on the other end of the suffering, the cross, and the shame? Well, what's listed here is seated at the right hand of God. The joy for Jesus to endure was to return to the Father. The joy for Jesus was to once again be in the presence of God the Father. He endured the cross. He finished his work. He completed his race so that he could then once again sit next to the Father. He had left, that's what we celebrated Christmas, to be with us, to endure in the cross, despise the shame, so he could do what? Be with the Father. See, that is the essence of the gospel. There's so many blessings and benefits of relationship and church and prayer and Bible study and the Holy Spirit that make the Christian life a wonderful, but when we share and tell of the gospel story to other people and even to each other and remind each other of the goodness of the gospel, the ultimate joy, the ultimate glory of all of that is to experience the presence of God. The joy for Jesus was that presence, and we must pursue that joy. You can talk about this idea of a greater joy. For example, when over Christmas, Charity made some wonderful chocolate fudge. I don't know if you've ever had chocolate fudge, homemade chocolate fudge. It's wonderful. Well, we also gave some of the kids some candy, so like a Hershey's bar, some M&Ms, right? And a chocolate bar from Hershey's is pretty good. But if you set before me a Hershey's bar and homemade chocolate fudge, you know what's the greater joy? It's that fudge. It tastes wonderful. I really shouldn't be talking about food while we're in church. But the idea is that we must remember a greatest joy that the gospel offers to those who believe is not these extemporaneous things, but it is God himself. It is the wonderful presence, the glory of God himself. And when we pursue the greatest joy there is, we then are able to follow in the steps of Jesus and to endure. And so what I want to do as we focus down in here, as we think about taking the elements in a little bit later, is what does it really mean then to look unto Jesus? And here's where there's a really neat thing that doesn't show up in English. This word for looking to Jesus has at the front of it in Greek the letters apo, apo. And that actually involves looking away. That's why apostate is someone who falls away. Or you think of the word apostle is someone who's sent away. In Greek, that apo means away from. So in English, we just say looking unto Jesus, but actually in the word, in the original language, it's looking away from other things to Jesus. This is actually a two-step process of looking. This is the act of looking away from all the other things of life and looking unto Jesus. And I got to watch this play out a little bit in our own household over the last few weeks. We were able to, Ruth got a bicycle for Christmas. Now, she's never ridden a bicycle before without training wheels, but I couldn't get training wheels, and so she just had to figure it out. Well, early on, she grasped the handlebars. You know where she looked as she pedaled? She kept looking at the front wheel. Well, you know who was in control of the front wheel? She was. And so all her fear and nervousness and tension kept moving the wheel around. Well, then she's looking at something that's going everywhere. And she'd tip over and she'd fall and she struggled. And so I had to keep helping her. Ruth, look up. Look up. Look up. Don't look at the wheel. Look up and the wheel will take care of itself. She had to look away from the wheel and look up where she was going. And the sustaining balance and the grace, the ability to ride her bike would come when she got her eyes away from what she was in charge of and on what was out there. I'll let you know, she got it. She's doing really well now. But the same thing is true for you and I in our life. I started by saying we're good at looking. We are really good at looking at the life and the world around us. Much like Peter, who stepped into the ocean, where did he look? At the waves. We often look at the life in front of us and what we're in control of. It will never work well. We must learn to look away from our own passions, desires, distractions ahead. Because like we said, do we know what the race is bringing this year? We do not. And we do not know what the road ahead looks like. We don't know the bumps, the hills, the turns, the valleys, where there's street lights, where there's darkness. I can't tell you that right now. But I can tell you that we can look unto Jesus. But looking unto Jesus requires looking away. And is a constant process of looking. In Job, there's a verse that says, I made a covenant with my eyes. Why shouldn't I look on a woman? When I disciple or work with men or young men over and over again, we talk about the idea even of lust. I have to be honest with them that it's never something that they will truly conquer. There's a constant decision to look away from one thing and to set your eyes on other things. The same is true of wealth or money. It is often easy to look at other things that are out there. And like I talked about, the things in the window shops. That looks nice. I would really like that. I have to look away and look unto Jesus. We must make a constant choice to look over. If we're able to put up the picture of the pace setter, we get it. Like I mentioned, I run races. One fascinating thing about races is that many people on the race are at different fitness levels. And so a lot of good races out there choose people to be what's called pace setters. And this is a friend of mine, Sue. She has run many, 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 many races. And she now volunteers as a pace setter. And you see what she does is she runs a race and she holds a sign up with the pace that she is going to run. So if you're not able to see, she's holding a sign that says 14. So she is going to run 14 minutes for every mile. And if you are going to make that your goal, your pace, you gather around where she is, and you have to keep looking. Now, there's a reason she's holding a sign, because in a crowd of people at a race, hundreds, thousands of people, it's really hard to see someone you're looking for. That's why she holds what? She holds a sign up with the goal on it. And if you are seeking that pace, what do you have to do? It's really easy when you're running a race to do what? Get your head down and just drag and look at the ground. I don't know if any of you are runners, but it's hard. But if you want to maintain that goal, that pace, what do you have to do? Lift your eyes up and keep your eyes on the sign and follow the pace setter. What's really neat is that idea of a pace setter is this idea where it says looking to Jesus, the author, the founder. The word really there is forerunner, the one who runs before and sets the pace. See, as Sue runs the race, do you know that Sue is actually capable of running way faster than 14 minutes a mile? She's an excellent runner. She can run half that speed, maybe even better. But you know what she chooses to do? She chooses to run 14 minutes a mile so that those who have made that their goal can run 14 minutes a mile. I actually ran a race one time with Sue, and my goal was to not let Sue pass me. So I just want to be faster than Sue's pace. But the idea is the same, is she could go so much faster, but she is holding the sign and running and enduring 14 minutes a mile, running for way longer than she might need to, so that other people can make that goal. You know that Jesus was perfect? Jesus had heaven, he had the presence of God, but you know what Jesus did? He came to earth to be our pace setter. He became a human to live as us, to experience growth, growing pains. He went through puberty. He grew up. He was probably hungry and thirsty and sweaty and smelly. All of those different things. Why did he experience that? So that he could hold the sign and say, this is the pace. This is how you live your life. You can look unto me. He ran slower than was capable so that we could follow him, so that we could look to him, so that we could pursue after him. But what we have to do is to constantly choose to look to him. Looking unto Jesus is not something you're going to decide. If I were to call you forward and say, who here wants to look unto Jesus this year? Come forward and commit to it. That would be great. But you know what you have to do tomorrow morning? You have to wake up and commit to looking unto Jesus. On Wednesday and Thursday, February, March, April, we as a church, if we are going to look unto Jesus, are going to have to do it each and every moment. Because much like a race, we're going to get worn out, our heads are going to go down, we're going to get discouraged, we're going to get downhearted. I guarantee we are 7 days into the new year, and if I were to ask for a show of hands, who here is facing a situation that seems hopeless, facing a challenge that is stressing you out, keeping you awake, making you wonder or question, am I doing the right thing? Am I on the right path? Where am I supposed to be going? As a church, you might have many of those same questions. What are we doing this year? How are we going to grow? What are we going to do? It's going to involve regularly making the same choice to look unto Jesus. I do something with our family, and since this is a church family, I'm going to introduce the concept to you all. So I want you to take a pointer finger, and I want you to point it in the air. So get your finger out, it won't hurt you, and point it in the air. All right, you can put it down. We do that in our family to remind each other without words that every choice, every action, every performance is intended for the glory and good of whom? Jesus. When my children step on the stage to perform and they're frightened and they're scared, who are they performing for? It's Jesus. If I leave them at the house alone and give them a task to do, and I'm not there, who are they to do it for? For Jesus. When you and I leave church and the pastor says, I want to encourage you to share the gospel, pastor's not going to follow you into your life that week to share the gospel. But we put our finger in the air, who wants us to talk about him? Jesus. What we need to do is encourage one another to regularly make the And we don't have to look, we don't have to talk. We see each other. I see Deacon Henry sometimes out. We've met like several times over Christmas break. What we could do is just point in the air. Are you choosing to look to Jesus? See, we as a body, Hebrews was preached to a group of people going through and about to experience persecution and suffering. Looking to Jesus does two things for different people. Looking to Jesus lifts up the head of those who are nervous and scared and points you to the one who suffered and endured for you, to give us strength and hope that the questions, the attacks of Satan, the words of other people, the questions we ask our own head When we look to Jesus, we can pursue after him. But looking into Jesus also calls those who are prone to be sidetracked, to refocus. We are tempted to pursue our own goals or our own avenues and looking to accomplish our own things. I want to let you know that the control you are trying to have, the pursuits of your own life, the control you think you have is much like Ruth trying to look at her bike. If you are constantly looking at your own success to measure your own worth or your value, it's going to move around a lot. In the world today, what it means to be a good person or a good employee or a good boss, a good community member is constantly changing. The world will call you to affirm different things at different times. We've seen it in our own world the past 6, 7, 10 years. If we're constantly looking to ourselves or society or culture, that wheel is just going to move around and we're going to tip and fall over and over and over again. If you think you want to be wealthy, if you think you want to be good looking, if you think you want to feel love the way you think you ought to have it, if you think you should feel validated and respected and admired and successful, I promise you, your own pursuits of all of those will fall flat. Because it's going to shift and it's going to change and you can't control everything and we're going to fail. Whether it's marriage, relationships, work, or even ministry, we have to constantly put our finger in the air and look to Jesus. This year as a church, that is what we're going to emphasize. Looking unto Jesus. And I know we all want Jesus to look at us. In the book of Exodus, right about the time when Moses was doing the burning bush, God says in Exodus chapter 2, verse 25, it's an amazing verse. Well, I'll start in verse 24. It says, God heard the groaning of the Israelites. God remembered his covenant with Isaac, with Jacob. And if you want a short verse to memorize Exodus 2:25. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Do we want God to see and look on us? We do. We want the loving view of God to rescue us, to deliver us, to save us, to protect us, to provide for us. We want God to look at us most of the time. Not all the time, right? But don't look at me right now, God. Let me do this thing that I want to do, and then you can look at me again. But that's the thing. If we want God to see us, we must look on him. Because the problem is if we choose not to look, and if we choose not to look unto God, there is an outcome for us. And in Zechariah chapter 12, near the end of the Old Testament, with a group of people who had struggled to look unto Jesus, and it tells us in Zechariah 12, verse 10, it says, I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him who they have pierced, they shall mourn as one mourns for an only child. It says, they will look on me as one who has been pierced. See, we're about to partake as a church body of communion. One of the reasons for taking communion is to what? To remind us to look. To remind us that Jesus endured. To remind us that the life we are called to live, that we are called to walk, is difficult, especially if we choose to follow God. Especially if we choose to walk in him. But I'll just wrap up with something that goes before in Hebrews chapter 11. Verse 26, talking about Moses. I'll start in verse 25. It says, choosing rather, this is Moses, to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was what? Looking, or had his eyes on the reward. You and I will have trials and difficulties. You probably have some right now. You probably desire greater wealth, reward, satisfaction, peace in this life. I can't promise it. Can't promise any of those things. But what Moses had, what Abraham had, and amazingly enough that Hebrews 12 tells us that Jesus himself had, was a joy that was set before him. On the other side of the endurance, it was the presence of God. And for us, since Jesus walked a path of endurance, and he knew exactly what he was going to go through, we can look to him, because while we don't know what we're going to go through, we know the one who went through it already. Looking unto Jesus calls for you and for me to constantly make the choice to pursue that which glorifies and honors God above our own fears, our failures. But if you have never chosen to look to Jesus today, if you have never put your faith in Jesus, you are choosing to live on your own strength and your own value, your own importance, and your own goodness, it will fail. You must choose today to set aside your own life, your own sin, the things we were singing about. My life is not my own, and choose to give and to pursue and to follow after Jesus. And if your question is, well, what was Jesus like? What was Jesus do? What did Jesus do? How can I do that every day? Well, that's the joy of the Christian body and meeting together and studying the Word and meeting with each other and asking questions and learning is the constant pursuit of knowing Jesus and following after him. That is what's ahead of us for this year, for this church. We as a body, and thus as individuals, must look to Jesus. That involves looking away. So today as we close in prayer, I want you to consider, what right now do you need to look away from? What is the problem, the situation, the fear, the worry, the pride, the arrogance, the desire? What is it that requires you to look away? And then make the choice, make the reminder for today, for tomorrow, to look to Jesus, to pursue him and to endure. And let us together run this race so that we can witness and testify to others and even ourselves for 2025 what this life will take and can give and what God provides above everything. Let's pray.